and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News. Hello there, giving the news a twist on this episode of Brazier. We start on the forecourts where drivers are paying at least 10p a litre more than they should. Howard Cox from Fairfuel UK is with me, and he's on the warpath. Not since John Prescott punched a voter have we seen this sort of thing. The man behind the middle finger has today announced he wants to be France's next president. I'll assess his chances with our man in Paris. Also going to be looking at another foreign news story. In recent days, it's been ignored by mainstream media, but does it have lessons for us here? It's the Polish border, where migrants have failed to break into Europe and are now going back to the Middle East.
Face coverings, that what we're looking at is retail and transport, just going back to a position where you have to wear them in retail settings or on public transport. But the health...
That's clear, isn't it? Back home, as Boris turns up the heat on COVID and face mask compliance kicks in, I'll ask a leading psychologist if the hokey-cokey of COVID rules is turning us into a nation of rebels. Tonight's Brazier Angle asks why fishermen opposed to migrant channel crossings may have tried to block the launch of a lifeboat in Hastings. Andrew Doyle will be asking why the European Commission has banned Christmas. And tonight's poll asks if Britain should strike a blow against cancel culture by making today, Winston Churchill's birthday, a national holiday. I'll be joined by one of Britain's leading historians to ponder on that. And you can vote in our poll right now. The best of your comments at the end of the show. All that's coming up, but first, a news update with Simon.
Thank you, Colin. Yes, I'm Simon Pusey, and these are your latest news headlines. The Prime Minister says all adults will be offered a booster jab by the end of January and that Christmas parties should go ahead. Speaking at the latest COVID briefing, Boris Johnson confirmed the military will help the NHS with the rollout. MPs also voted in favour of new restrictions, including face coverings in shops and on public transport in England. Travellers coming into the UK will also have to self-isolate until they receive a negative PCR result.
There'll be temporary vaccination centres popping up like Christmas trees, and will deploy at least 400 military personnel to assist the efforts of our NHS, alongside, of course, the fantastic Jabs army of volunteers.
Well, that's Boris Johnson, and the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, is urging everyone to get jabbed ahead of the Christmas festivities.
This is a national mission, and we all have a role to play. If we want to give ourselves the best chance of a Christmas with our loved ones, the best thing we can all do is step up, roll up our sleeves and get protected when the time comes.
Meanwhile, Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has updated Holyrood on the latest developments with the Omicron variant. She says overall infection levels have been falling over the last week, but still urges caution.
I very much hope that as we do learn more, our level of concern will diminish rather than increase. However, while hoping very much for the best, I think it is prudent at this stage to contemplate and prepare for something that is less positive than that.
The Justice Secretary says the backlog of court cases is serious and needs to be reduced quickly. Dominic Raab said remote hearings will become part of the new normal and help bring down numbers. By the end of June, there were nearly 61,000 outstanding Crown Court cases and more than 364,000 in the magistrates. A US court has heard claims Ghislaine Maxwell was Jeffrey Epstein's go-to person to handle everything. Lawrence Vizosky told jurors at her sex trafficking trial in New York that Maxwell was Epstein's number two. The British socialite has been accused of recruiting teenagers for Jeffrey Epstein to sexually abuse for 10 years from 1994. She's been in a US jail since her arrest in July last year and denies any wrongdoing. Nearly 17,000 properties in Scotland are experiencing a fifth day without power after Storm Arwen. Engineers are working to restore supply to the northeast and southwestern parts of the country, which have been the hardest hit. Deputy First Minister John Swinney said Storm Arwen was a more significant weather event than the beast from the east in 2018. And Ellen White has become England women's all-time leading goalscorer. She's reached 47 goals for her country after scoring twice in a World Cup qualifying match against Latvia. The Lionesses are top of Group D with maximum points from 5 games. You are right up to date. Now back to Brazier.
Well, for the avoidance of any doubt, let's be clear. If true, and as described, events in Hastings last week were lamentable and indefensible. The story of what happened 10 days ago has now come to prominence after the RNLI lifeboat charity confirmed that one of its rescue vessels was briefly stopped from launching from its boathouse in Hastings last week. The RNLI statement came after a call to a radio phone-in show on Thursday by a woman who identified herself as Zoe, who said this: "There was a group of fishermen gutting fish on the shore, and as the boat station opened up, we heard the fishermen start shouting things like, 'Don't bring any more of those home, we're full up.' And that's why we stopped our donations." And that kind of really horrible stuff, you could hear the hatred in their voices. Well, it's important to note that the RNLI said that its boat was able to launch after a delay. It's not clear how long the boat had to wait or why it was heading into the English Channel. But given recent events, the tragic deaths of 27 migrants and the arrival of getting on for 30,000 foreign nationals by sea this year, it may well be that it was heading to intercept a dinghy coming from France. Well, there are people who feel the RNLI are acting inadvertently as a pull factor for migrants who know that if they reach international waters, our lifeboats will bring them safe to shore. There are those frustrated at this who feel the RNLI is effectively complicit with people smuggling. Others still say the number of call-outs to pick up migrants is putting an impossible strain on the volunteer lifeboat crews. Contrary to what some refugee groups insist, these are all legitimate concerns. But the way to express them is not by direct action, not like this. And that's what this is. Standing in front of a lifeboat is not so very different, really, from standing in front of an ambulance on the M25. The outrageous behaviour of green activists from Insulate Britain, some of whom sought to stop paramedics responding to a 999 call, was rightly seen as undemocratic. And if these allegations are true, anyone seeking to stop a lifeboat launching does not deserve to call themselves a Democrat either. They do have a case, but doing this undermines it. All that said, the reaction to these allegations tells another story. Let's share it with you. Typical was this on Twitter from the singer Billy Bragg, who wrote, "Shocking developments in the ongoing war on empathy. People angry at the RNLI for rescuing refugees attempt to block the launch of the Hastings lifeboat." The former rugby player and BBC presenter Brian Moore told his followers, "This is what Farage, Grimes et al. Have been trying to action all along. Shameful." Well, Moore's right, it is shameful, but not in the way he probably intends. What characters like Bragg and Moore prefer not to confront is the reality of illegal migration. Tens of thousands of mainly young men, predominantly from the Middle East and Africa, who are now waiting for their asylum claims to be processed. While they wait a wait that may take years, some of them will assimilate into British society easily. Others won't. They won't even come close. and they will put further strains on areas where social cohesion is already in retreat. Neighbourhoods where commentators like Bragg and Moore choose not to live because they're sufficiently wealthy and well-connected not to. It's people like my sister in Bradford who, as usual, will be living the daily reality of our government's failure to control illegal migration. How many of those tweeting today about this delayed lifeboat launch, not just Bragg and Moore, but all those who wrap themselves in the comforting duvet of superior moral virtue, really have to deal with the consequences? These people give off a terrible smell. Sanctimony is one way of describing it. That's tonight's Brazier Angle. Now, on parts of Britain's transport network, officials were out warning passengers to make sure they wore a mask because today it became mandatory to do so, thanks to the latest COVID variant. Well, on my journey to work on the tube today, there was definitely more mask wearing, but there were many folk too without face coverings. Are we seeing less COVID compliance as lockdown fatigue kicks in? The polling suggests there is still a broad willingness to do as we're told, but will that goodwill last indefinitely? Is it inexhaustible? And actually, this is more about more than just compliance, isn't it? Lockdown has definitely, it seems to many, radicalised a swathe of people who never before perhaps considered themselves to be disgruntled with the relationship between state and citizen. Let's turn to Dr. Audrey Tang, author and psychologist. Audrey, thanks so much for your time today. Do appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Colin.
Hi. Compliance fatigue, are we seeing it yet?
I think we were already seeing it a lot earlier. People are exhausted. We have been living under changing rules, uncertainty for coming on to 2 years now. And a lot of people are actually pushed to the end of their tether. What could have helped them sustain themselves for maybe a year, maybe even a year and a half, that's running very thin. And when we're in survival mode, we do tend to think about ourselves first. So I think the first issue is we are exhausted. But the second issue, which comes into that, is where are the results? The sad part is we've been down this road before and we still didn't save Christmas last year. And now we're looking at this and the question mark is raised again. On top of this, humans have a very innate sense of fairness. And if we're complying, but we see government ministers, perhaps other high-profile celebrities not doing so, we do begin to question, well, why on earth am I doing it? And then, of course, the last thing there is knowledge. Do we all actually know where we're supposed to be wearing our masks? That changes. The laws are not always easy to read if you actually look at the minutiae of what's written in the legislation itself. And so there are question marks over our understanding, the fairness and the exhaustion that we're all feeling.
On the fairness point, Audrey, I mean, when we had Freedom Day in June, July, whenever it was, it feels an age ago now, we didn't think at the time, did we, that it was provisional? I mean, I suppose we were told, weren't we? It was conditional on what was happening with the virus, but it felt, there was an air of finality about the thing. It felt definitive. It felt like we'd paid our dues, we'd served our penance, and now we were free. And it turns out not to be like that at all.
I think we were hopeful. I know that every comment that I made in the media, it was very much about it being provisional and that we had to always have a plan B. That's very important. But at the same time, goodwill does run out. We don't have the same spirit as we did right at the very beginning of the pandemic because we've seen it. We can't say this is unprecedented anymore. And also we have become quite upset perhaps with people at least seeing to break the rules, and that seems a little bit unfair when the rest of us are following them. Another thing I would add is, like yourself, I was on the train. This was when the tweet came out from the government to say that masks were going to be mandatory, and actually every single person on that packed train wore a mask, and we don't get much thanks for things like that. And I know it's very boring to thank all the people who are following the rules and much more exciting to look at all the rule breakers. But at the same time, it doesn't go amiss if we do have a little bit of gratitude.
Yeah, I think the worry is from some people, and it's certainly a worry I've got, Audrey, is that it creates a supine populace, that it's fine, what you describe as compliance and public spiritedness. To one person it's that, to somebody else it is about actually bending over to every whim and diktat of the state.
Only if there's no evidence that these things work, and these measures are effective. We are aware of that, and that's something that has to be kept in mind. When it comes to our motivation, it's calculated very crudely on a basis of the efficacy of a measure that's been put in, plus the value that we get out of it, less the cost that we have to expend. And that can be the same for weight loss. It can be the same for changing any habit to a positive one. So what we do need to see are the results. If we can track wearing the masks and this is what happens, and we can actually get told that sort of information, that can be very helpful. Maybe making it very easy for us to wear masks, perhaps even giving out masks, something like that. The value of it. That way we can actually also benefit, and reducing the cost to us. Now, admittedly, with wearing a mask, to me, that's not that difficult, but I do understand how it can be very difficult to read lips. It can be very difficult for teachers when they're working with young people as well. And it can be quite scary when people are masked as well.
The amount of stalking has leapt because people are able to hide behind their masks. Just to flip this around a little bit, I was having a pop last night at Professor Susan Mickey, who's a psychologist and on SAGE, advising the government. But actually, obviously, part of the calculations about lockdown include psychology, include the stuff that you do. And I think back to what Chris Whitty said right at the beginning, that he didn't want to go too hard too early because eventually the patience would start to run out. In a sense, he's been proved right.
Yes, and also, if you look at the guidance from the WHO about managing pandemic fatigue, that was something that they had suggested themselves. And what they were talking about was bringing in community leaders, bringing in different messages, giving people a little bit of choice on the way things are and how we manage the progression through the pandemic. But at the same time, we also have to look at when we don't act fast enough. And that can cause huge problems, such as strain on the NHS.
Audrey Tang, really appreciate your time. Some interesting thoughts there. Thanks a lot. Now let's talk about fuel. If you filled up your car or van recently, did you notice how the price of fuel has been plummeting? No, you didn't, did you? Because it's believed retailers are overcharging on the forecourt to the tune of 12p a litre for petrol, 10p a litre for diesel. We've been here before, of course, cuts in wholesale prices of oil not being passed on nearly quickly enough by the big petrol station brands. We're not picking on that one. But what makes this particularly embittering is that the price of fuel has risen by a fifth in not very long at all, taking it to levels never seen before in Britain. Recently, though, wholesale prices, they've been falling. On Friday, for instance, the cost of Brent crude dropped 3% in the day because of concerns about the Omicron virus. So where then are the price cuts? Here's Howard Cox of Fair Fuel UK. I imagine, Howard, a little hot under the collar.
Good evening, Colin. Yes, that's putting it mildly, my friend. I mean, what's happening at the moment in time, the pump pricing process is so opaque, unfair, and a closely guarded secret. We've got no idea how this happens. And let me give an example. Just 2 years ago, in November, so we're in November now, 2 years ago, the wholesale price was 112 pence. It is now, this is petrol, 116. It's 4p more. And yet pump prices are 21p more. And if it's same with diesel, it's only a penny more compared to 2 years ago in terms of wholesale prices. And we're looking at a 21p increase for diesel as well. So a penny in wholesale, but the pump prices are 21p more. The government, how long is the government going to continue to allow unchecked profiteering in the fuel supply chain? And that's what we're asking.
Yeah, we'll come back on to what the government does about it. But just on the point about the prices, I mentioned Friday there in my introduction, wholesale prices going down 3%. They went back up a little bit afterwards. But my point is, it's not stable. It's massively erratic. And if you are one of these, big fuel operators, are you really going to, is it going to be up and down every day? Are you going to really follow slavishly the wholesale fuel price? No, you can't do that, can you? That's no way to run a business.
Well, I'm afraid it happens in France. The prices go up and down morning and night and afternoons. You see them going. You can sit by actually a pricing board outside of a garage and see it change in the day based on fuel prices, wholesale prices. But obviously the excuse that's usually given by the fuel supply chain is that obviously they buy in bulk and they've bought it at one price and they've got to sell it that what's in the bulk off for the price that you actually bought it for, or with a margin. Understandably so. And it's not the retailer's fault. It's the fuel supply chain, the wholesalers and oil companies who are dictating this. And I'm afraid they need to be investigated. And we don't want a cap system. We just want some sort of pump watch system introduced, like we've got for gas, electricity, water and telecoms, some sort of body that gives consumer price transparency, not necessarily protection, transparency.
You make a very good point, actually, in this sense, Howard, that when we look at those latest inflation figures, which were higher than anybody expected, and a very large component of the rise was domestic gas, it was domestic electricity, both, as you say, markets which enjoy a degree of regulatory and governmental oversight. But this seems to be the one glaring exception to that rule. How practically, how would it work? If there was to be a regulator looking at forecourts, would it be sort of, once a year, once a quarter, once a week, once a day? How much regulation would they be doing?
Well, that's a very good point. I had a meeting with the all-party parliamentary group about 2 to 3 years ago with Robert Jenrick when he was MP, when he was Exchequer Secretary. And he said he wasn't in favour of a regulatory body, but he was in favour of a voluntary system, like a kite mark, so that every garage would actually have on its side, we adhere, some kite mark that tells them we adhere to actually fair pricing. When oil price changes or exchange rate changes, we adhere to this process where we give fair pricing to people filling up on the forecourt. That's the sort of thing we'd like to see at the moment to starting off, and I think they would adhere to that. We want garages to make a decent living, a decent profit. There's no way we want to be. I come from a free market situation, even though this government isn't in a free market situation. They're telling us we can't buy diesel and petrol cars in 2030, Colin, as you know. Those are the sorts of things. They're interfering into a market and telling us what modal transport, why they need laws to tell us what modal or electric vehicles we need to drive. I just don't understand. It means they don't believe in the process. But going back to this point here, we do not want a regulator. We want some sort of voluntary system that would, and I'd like to work with various people like the Petrol Retailers Association, and the RAC has suddenly woken up and said they're calling for scrutiny too. I'm delighted. We've been calling for it since 2013, when we had actually an investigation with the Competitions and Market Authority. Then I took 10 MPs and stood outside and handed in 110,000 signatures. But that was a whitewash that came out. They said didn't see any abnormal anomalies in the fuel pricing process.
Howard, we've got to leave it there, but you make a very good point about the petrol stations needing to make money. That's one of the problems we had early this year, wasn't it? That we had too few petrol stations, and hence we had one of the reasons we had the problems that we did with the queues, etc. Howard Cox, really good to talk to you. Thanks ever so much for your time. After the break, this year schools have dropped the name Churchill. Even an institution set up in his name distanced itself from the great man's legacy. Today it's Sir Winston's birthday, and we will not let the Killjoys spoil his day.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Good evening. It's been much milder today, but colder air is going to return. Certainly feeling cold in the winds tomorrow. A bit brighter with some sunshine, but there will be showers, and those showers in places likely to turn wintry. This area of low pressure is developing, and as it heads into the North Sea, really producing some strong winds across the coast of northeast England again. And after Storm Arwen hits at the weekend, that is not good news for this part of the world. As well as the winds picking up, there's going to be plenty of rain around. That rain turning heavy at the moment across Scotland. A band of rain will whiz across England and Wales this evening, followed by some very lively showers when the winds will suddenly just whip up. So you may get woken up by the gusty winds tonight. Temperatures dropping down, but generally staying a few degrees above freezing, thanks mostly to the strength of the wind. That wind will be very lively then along some North Sea coasts in the morning, providing plenty of showers here as well. Some of those could be of hail, rain showers for Wales, southwest England, and the showers turning more and more wintry over northern Scotland as the day goes on. But there will be sunny spells, and there's going to be a cold feel to the day. Temperatures back to single figures, and add on that wind, it feels even colder. Certainly getting pretty cold on Wednesday evening, with further snow likely over northern Scotland, and then the potential through tomorrow evening for a mixture of rain, sleet and some snow to push south over southwest Scotland, northwest England into parts of Wales. So in this zone you may wake up to a covering on Thursday morning. The potential for things to turn icy as well, because as the winds ease, temperatures will drop further. So it's a cold start to Thursday. Could be some ice around and still some snow mixed in as this weather system trickles south across Wales into southwest England on Thursday morning. So again, may wake up to a covering in places here. Generally a fine sunny day on Thursday, but it will be cold, but those winds at least will be a little bit lighter.
Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News. Well, about 20 years ago, the BBC held a poll and asked a pretty simple question: who is the greatest Briton? The result was really emphatic, actually. 500,000 people, thereabouts, voted for Sir Winston Churchill, whose case at the time was put by the former Labour minister, the old Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and other things besides, the late Mo Mowlam. Well, the next nearest contender was the engineer, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who secured 50,000 votes, nowhere near Churchill. Princess Diana came third. Today, on what would have been, were he still alive, Churchill's birthday, I think it's worth asking a couple of questions. First, would the BBC still run a very lengthy, very expensive 6-part show that resulted in quite such a patriotic poll result? And second, now that Churchill's reputation has begun to fall foul of cancel culture, it really has, as we're about to discuss, not least thanks to the efforts of the BBC, could you still find someone on the left of politics who would so publicly stand up and defend a Prime Minister whose reputation is now, as I say, contested, where once it was really quite universally revered, at least in this country? Let's show you the results of a poll we've had on this, which has generated a lot of interest. See if we can pull it up for you. Today, yep, there it goes. Birthday, Winston Churchill. Should Britain show it has no time for cancel culture by naming a public holiday in his honour? People always want public holidays, but this is just to rename one. That's a broad idea. 9 out of 10 of you think that's a jolly good idea indeed. Let's turn to Andrew Doyle, who is here. Andrew, the point I'm trying to make is, I suppose more broadly there, is it possible within our cultural clashes at the moment for people who feel they're constantly surrendering territory actually to do things which start to inch back a little bit? In this case, OK, we're seeing various assaults upon the memory of Winston Churchill. Actually, let's have a national day honouring him just like in America there's a Martin Luther King Day.
Yeah, I don't see any reason why not. I think perhaps a better way to do it is to not take a sort of antagonistic stance, but to sort of say, OK, if you want to have those conversations about the things that Churchill said and did, let's have them. Because when you have the conversations properly and talk about historical context, you start to realise that actually the views that he had, although by our standards we wouldn't find them acceptable, were not atypical of the time, were they? So, and that's the key issue. If you had a statesman today who was talking about the superiority of certain races, we'd all have a problem with it, and we'd all take them to task, and we wouldn't stand for it. But if someone of Churchill's time saying that, at a time when it wasn't considered controversial, then what's the point in sort of holding him to the standards that we hold people today? It doesn't actually make sense.
That point really came home to me probably more than 20 years ago now. I was at a South African Boer War battlefield, Spion Kop,
yes,
which of course gave its name then to various Spion Kops,
at
Anfield and elsewhere. At that single battle, there was Winston Churchill as a young British Army officer. There was Jan Smuts, who went on to lead the South African nation, as it was then incarnated, and a young Mahatma Gandhi, who was there as a medical orderly. And if you look at some of Gandhi's views,
same thing. Some of his views on African people was, by our standards, horrific, and that's why, incidentally, some people have called for his statue to be taken down. I think in Manchester, that is. So, so again, we are faced with this problem again of failing to contextualise these historical figures, which doesn't really make sense. If we have a Churchill Day, it's not going to be a day to celebrate every last thing the man ever said or did. It's going to be predominantly about him beating Hitler, isn't it? I mean, that's
do you know what it mustn't be, Andrew? What it mustn't be, that dreadful phrase that you hear increasingly now, peddled by people who are not actually particularly tolerant. Educate yourself.
Oh, well,
I'm not suggesting anybody educates themselves about Winston Churchill.
Do you know what? If anyone who uses that phrase, they never read books. That's the first thing. They are the least qualified to tell anyone else to educate themselves, because they don't know about history. And the idea that they've got this sense that they can live a life of complete moral purity and that they won't be judged by future generations for the standards that they currently hold, it's completely historically illiterate and myopic. And it's actually quite funny in a way. But I think this idea, I find it really troubling for a number of reasons. But we lose out so much when we stand here in this high-handed way and denigrate the past because they're not the same as us. I mean, to give an example, one of my favourite novelists is the suffragette writer Stella Benson. And one of her early novels, it's called I Pose, has racialised language and depictions of different races that absolutely we would find abhorrent. I mean, even when I was reading it, I was thinking, oh, this is a bit much.
Yeah.
But it was totally uncontroversial at the time.
Yeah.
But as a result of that now, this is a novelist who we've lost. We could never reintroduce her now, even though she was just a genius, because of those elements of her.
You know what, Andrew? I just want people to look at Churchill's life.
Yeah, right.
Because actually, it was the most extraordinary life. I mean, I forgot, there's so much about his life you forget.
Yeah.
I mean, after the disaster of Gallipoli, he just went to the trenches.
Right.
And served as, I think he was a colonel with the Scottish regiment in the trenches.
Exactly.
He put himself on the line and risked his life, nearly died in the trenches. He was in his 50s, but for heaven's sake.
But people want to reduce him to just certain aspects of his life that they
the Nobel Prize for Literature.
Right.
What was it he did on pensions and social security? I mean, I know clearly, it's such a mixed picture, but it's the most varied picture, the most extraordinary human mosaic that one life story can tell. And to dismiss him as the people who run a primary school in Richmond, southwest London, did the other week, and replacing him with either, I don't know who it was, Marcus Rashford or
I think they replaced
Mary Seacole.
J.K. Rowling it was J.K. Rowling and Winston Churchill. They replaced with Mary Seacole and Marcus Rashford. And of course, because they're just thinking in terms of identity politics, that's all they're thinking about. And that again reduces everything to this simplistic view of history. And every life is complex. And it's not to suggest that we don't currently disapprove of some of the things that he would have said, because of course we do, inevitably, because of the time in which we are born. But had we all been born in Churchill's time, actually, had these activists who want to remove his name been born in Churchill's time, I can pretty much guarantee they would share a lot of his views that they currently find repugnant. So, they're not really in a position to judge.
How comfortable are you on the 30th of November talking about Christmas?
I'm not comfortable, actually, because I tell you what, when I see them selling Christmas gifts and tinsel in supermarkets, I'm a real Puritan about this.
It's funny, you come over all Mr. Grumpy, and it's not at all. But
no, I think don't prematurely celebrate Christmas. Can we not at least start in December? At least once the first flap of the Advent calendar is
open. I promise you, the next time you're seeing there's going to be a little pathetic little tree between you and I, with maybe a couple of those little.
I wouldn't put it past you. I'm sure that's what you want to do.
I mention this because the European Commission has banned mention of Christmas. It's now Happy Holidays. There's an inclusive language guide, which they've withdrawn on the grounds it was insufficiently mature. In other words, they got a lot of flack for it.
Yes.
But this is a supranational institution that ought to know better. We do this story every year.
We do.
They shouldn't be falling for that old chestnut.
That's also why we need to be really clear about what's actually happened. So the person responsible for equality in the European Commission, her name is Helena Dali, and she produced this guidance to basically compel EU officials to avoid phrases like man-made, and she suggested human-induced instead of man-made, for instance, which just sounds like a robot created that phrase. Yeah. So all these sorts of things sort of suggest that we don't use Mr, Miss and Ms, we use MX as a default, so that whenever I would address you as Mux,
I've wondered how that works.
I think I don't know. Anyway, but I would be doing that as a default until you said actually. Who knows? But then they withdrew it because they got flagged. Now, this does happen again and again and again. And I'm always wary because often it is reported as, oh, they're trying to cancel Christmas. No one actually is trying to cancel Christmas. They're talking about the language that people use about Christmas. And the other reason I'm wary is because if you go back to 2011, you'll remember when the Daily Mail had to retract a story about Winterval, because they had claimed that the Birmingham Council were trying to ban Christmas and replace it with Winterval. That never happened. What they're in fact trying to do is just create a term to incorporate religious and secular holiday festivals. It was nothing to do with banning Christmas. But that lingered for years, and people continue. Even now, some people say this Winterval thing. So I'm wary and always a bit sceptical about these stories. But what I can say is this is the European Commission producing guidelines telling people not to use the word Christmas. That is true, right? And so that means that there's a problem. The civil service has done it recently as well in the UK, saying avoid.
That's what I need on this desk, a proper manger.
Well, yeah, go for the religious symbology, but that's what it's all about.
Nativity scene.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if I'm going to send Christmas cards, which I may not, I'm a bit of a Scrooge, I will make sure they have a religious iconography about them, I think.
Just finally, and perhaps more evidence that it is possible to push back, and the world isn't always going to hell in a handcart. Sometimes we lull ourselves collectively into believing. There's been a review in Sheffield looking at the place names, street names and that sort of thing, and colonial ties with colonialism, slavery, etc. And actually, they're not going to alter things. They're not getting their paintbrushes out, are they?
So this is a good example, because what happened after the BLM protest in the summer of 2020, a lot of councils and institutions decided to do a review of various statues, landmarks, street names and things like that. Most people came out saying, most people consulted the people that it would affect, the people in the local area, and in 9 times out of 10, the local people say, no, we don't want to change it. Now, what's been happening is some councils are doing it anyway, because they don't really care what the people think. But in this case, Sheffield Council are saying, OK, we've spoken to the people, they don't want to change it, we're not going to change it. Now, that is, of course, the right decision, because some of these street names they want to change, it's so tenuous. It's things like Gladstone Street, they want to rename because Gladstone's father was implicated in the slave trade. So it's even sins of the fathers now. Really, this was just a knee-jerk reaction to the killing of George Floyd, which, of course, has nothing to do with British history. And it's very strange that an event like that can trigger these chain of events where people have these knee-jerk reactions. I mean, in about 10 years' time, people will look back and think, why did everyone overreact in this way? Because and this is a good example of actually a council saying, no, we've looked into it, we've asked people understand that to name a street Canning Street doesn't mean that we all support everything that Canning believed in. It's not rocket science, is it?
No. Andrew, we're going to leave it there. I'll reflect again on that poll that we commissioned about should there be a national holiday for Winston Churchill, and I will definitely look into claiming for a nativity scene that can be desk-bound here, ideally on expenses, and it's going to be maybe there the next time you come in.
OK, well, as long as it's tasteful.
Wow. Andrew, thanks a lot. After the break, we're going to speak to Peter Allen, who has just interviewed the latest candidate to join the race in the upcoming French election. Should be an interesting chat.
Coming up Tuesday on Dan Wootton Tonight, one of the most straight-talking figures in politics, Anne Widdecombe, gives her blistering take on the latest COVID madness. Plus, I'll react to more bombshell revelations from the doc that's exposed royal infighting and infuriated the palace. Then we'll crown another Greatest Britain Union Jack as you'll get to voice your opinion in the clash, and I'll break down the day's top stories with my superstar panel, the author Rebecca Reed, the Conservative commentator Calvin Robinson, and the Daily Star columnist Dawn Neeson. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of 2 wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News. Well, at the beginning of this month, the eyes of the world's media really were fixated on the Polish border. Thousands of migrants had been herded there as part of an attempt to effectively weaponise asylum seekers against NATO and the EU. Camera crews and charities insisted that the only way to resolve a looming humanitarian crisis was by letting migrants pass through Poland's border so they could reach Western Europe. But in spite of that pressure, Poland refused to relent. Warsaw's hard line was helped, not least probably by these scenes, rioting migrants who attacked border guards and soldiers with missiles, trees, logs, poles, anything they could get their hands on. By last week, many of the foreign media who'd gone to report on the plight of migrants had gone home, and now it seems so too are hundreds of the migrants themselves. Iraq is one Middle Eastern state to have laid on charter flights to repatriate its nationals. So is one conclusion to be drawn here that if a country holds the line, is prepared to hold the line, it can subsequently weather the media storm demanding that migrants should be allowed to move pretty much wherever they wish. Joining me now from Warsaw is Marek Matraszek, chairman of the CEC Group Political Consultancy. Marek, thanks so much for your time.
Good evening, Colin.
Good evening to you.
Pleasure.
Do you agree with my deduction? It's a bit simplistic, I suppose, that just by holding the line, eventually some of the migrants who had decamped to that border that you share with Belarus had decided it wasn't worth the candle and it was time to go home. I mean, it is one reading of the situation, isn't it?
Well, you're perfectly right, Colin. I mean, one of the things that the Polish government realised very early on in this crisis is that these migrations were not, in fact, spontaneous migrations, but they were organised criminal rackets run by people traffickers who had set up a business model which was predicated on both supply and demand. In other words, the demand of the migrants to be able to get into Germany and the supply of vehicles, infrastructure, and winning governments to accept them into the European Union. Now, that's been basically destroyed. The Polish government was very vigorous in basically saying no. Under no circumstances, or whatever the noise in the background from humanitarian organizations, NGOs, various other media pressure, there just will be no passage. And I think that's been a crucial element of the success. I mean, there have been other factors as well. There was a well-focused media campaign focused at the migrants themselves, get them to understand this situation. But it's basically picking up the people traffickers' business model that's worked so far.
It's interesting. There is a propaganda war at work. I mean, that's part of the hybrid warfare thing, right? I just wonder to what extent you feel that those shots with the pictures we were showing of the rioting migrants was decisive, because anybody in Warsaw, in politics in Warsaw, who is thinking of aligning themselves with those humanitarian groups at that point would have really struggled to sell that message of clemency. But also on a more practical note, I mean, I know the Poles were criticised for having this 3-mile wide, 3-mile deep media exclusion zone. So yes, you could report the story from the side of the border that is, as we're looking at those pictures where the green roofed building is, that's the Belarusian side of the border, where the water cannons are firing from, Polish side of the border, there were no journalists there. And I just wonder whether, though it feels anti-democratic, it actually helped them control the information flow and the story.
Well, you're quite right, Colin. I mean, one of the things that Lukashenko, who's actually working hand in glove with these trafficking organisers recognised early on was that if you manage to get the Western media focused on the humanitarian story, it will weaken resistance. And the Polish government, in introducing a state of emergency, did in fact ban the access to the border area of NGOs and West media organisations, Polish television included. And in retrospect, that was a very wise decision, because had we been fed pictures day after day of purported migrants suffering in the weak political resolve, as the right decision. And by the way, just today, the Polish president has signed into law a new law which actually extends for another 6 months that no-go zone, and it's been extended from 3 kilometres to 15 kilometres to some extent. So it's a recognition by Poland the crisis is not over, but they are taking very firm measures to, as you say, get the ability of Lukashenko to pump his propaganda into Western media to limit that.
Well, Marek, we've partly answered our own question, my next question, which is going to be to what extent are there any lessons that you can read from the Polish situation here in the UK? I mean, quite clearly, we're not talking about a land border problem for one, but the idea that we would wear in this country a 15-mile wide exclusion zone where the media were not allowed to go and report on what was happening, absolutely unfeasible. And part of the situation here on the Polish-Belarusian border, I'm guessing you know far better than I do, is that it was fairly remote. There weren't many people there. People were not necessarily wandering around with smartphones, uploading it to social media groups, etc. So you could keep a lid on the thing. Is there anything we can draw? Are there any lessons for a British government that's struggling to control illegal migration into the UK, that lessons they can draw from what appears to be the successful management so far of this problem in Poland?
Well, bear in mind what Poland stopped was not only migration into Poland, but migration further on into Germany, because I think that would have been an absolute disaster had the Poles agreed to migrant convoys moving across the territory of the country. That would have encouraged even greater flows. Well, but the UK, of course, is in a unique position because once the migrants get to the UK, there's nowhere else to go. They just stay here. So the political pressure is even greater. But I'll go back to my original point, Colin. It's all about the business model. If you can get migrants who have actually very well read, they're on smartphones in Syria and Iraq, they understand what's going on. If you can actually get the message to them that they have no success in getting into the country, even if they get in, they can't stay for very long, that's a huge disincentive. And unfortunately, what we've seen is with the robustness of the Polish government, that's something that the British government, I think, could also pay attention is to actually make it much less attractive and much less promising for migrants to make that journey and take that risk of getting across the English Channel, because they feel that once they get over, they can stay in the UK, and that's a fatal mistake.
And do you think in doing all that, the principle has been demonstrated that actually if you practice tough love, if you say you're not coming in under any circumstances, and if you do come in, you'll be repatriated, even if it's just to the other side of the border we share with Belarus, that the consequence of that is that ultimately, not in the short term, but the medium and long term, fewer people from those countries we've mentioned, from Iraq, from Syria, from Eritrea, wherever it is, actually make that hazardous journey and find themselves literally freezing to death in the forests of Poland.
Well, absolutely. They were promised passage to Germany, passage through Poland. Reality verified that. And I think what you've seen now is there are now repatriation flights going back, which is remarkable, actually going back to Iraq. And so they realised they've been able to get into Poland. Again, the UK in a very peculiar position, because once they do get over the English Channel into the UK, the UK is not able actually even to push them back across the Channel. So a lot depends on whether or not the UK can persuade the French government, for example, to, as it were, clam up the ability of the migrants to get into boats in the first place to get across the Channel on the French coast. So that's an issue which Boris Johnson has been struggling with greatly, as we know, due to his correspondence with President Macron. So there's a lesson there. I think the UK government recognises that what the solution could be, but the problem is not just in the UK government's position. It's the difficulty that we're facing with getting the French government also to cooperate in that strategy, and I think that's the problem that ultimately is the key one for the UK.
Marek, just one final thought. I wonder, there was clearly a lot behind that decision to offer from the UK some very, very limited military support. I think it was no more than 10 advisors from the Royal Engineers who were sent there to help the Poles consider earthworks and their border defences and the frontier and how robust it was in terms of people getting across. But that idea of acknowledging that the problem actually has to be addressed at the borders of Europe, because once people are inside and once they're in the Schengen zone, they can move around pretty freely. And if they want to head all the way, not just to Germany, not just to France, but to Britain, then there really is very little to stop them doing that. That the lesson here actually is if you want to stop very substantial numbers of illegal migrants coming across Europe, you stop them at the borders of Europe.
Yeah, well, indeed, in fact, that's the main message that Prime Minister Morawiecki of Poland has been stressing. He's been travelling around both Central Europe and Western Europe. He was in the UK last week, exactly trying to drum up a multinational support for Poland, and actually saying this is not actually just a Polish problem. This is an EU problem. This is a NATO problem. And we've seen, apart from the British forces, the Royal Engineers, there's been military aid also coming up from Slovakia, down from Lithuania. So that internationalization, as well, Europeanization, in a good sense of that term, is actually being very, very thoroughly being forced through by the Polish government. And hopefully they'll get more support in the future for their stance, which, as you say, is actually a model of how you actually deal with this problem.
Marek Matuszek, really appreciate your time, Marek. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Now, it's often been said, not least recently, that the migrant crisis in the English Channel, just discussing it there a moment ago, can't be resolved this side of a French presidential election. The vote to decide who will be the next leader of France takes place in 5 months' time. And today, a contender who had been doing well in the polls announced he would indeed be standing. He is Eric Zemmour, crikey, 63-year-old journalist and author who has scandalised parts of French society. There he is, pictured on Sunday, reciprocating the welcome given to him by a voter in Marseille. On his visit, he described the city as having been, quote, disintegrated by immigration. Part of his pitch to voters is that France is unrecognisable following an influx of millions of Muslim immigrants, and that Paris should regain control of its borders. Well, Zemmour's poll ratings had been soaring, but in the last few weeks they have started to fall. To help us understand why the wheels might now be falling off the Zemmour bandwagon, here's the Paris-based journalist Peter Allen. Peter, thanks so much for your time. Do appreciate it. What's gone wrong?
Hello, Colin. He's having a bit of a wobble. I think that's probably the fairest way to put it. Of course, his great rival in any presidential contest is always going to be Marine Le Pen. She's offering a very different type of far-right nationalism. In effect, a more moderate type of far-right nationalism, if that's at all possible. But it is when you look at the kind of discourse that Eric Zemmour becomes involved in. But that said, he's still got a very good chance. Remember, he hasn't been a candidate up until now. His campaign starts today. He appeared on TF1, the main broadcaster here in Paris tonight, and said he's no longer Eric Zemmour, the polemicist, the TV journalist, the pop writer, I would say the pseudo-intellectual, to be unfair to him, but that's what many of us call him. He is now Eric Zemmour, the presidential candidate. He's somebody who thinks he can be a head of state. The French system allows an individual to come forward, as Emmanuel Macron did back in 2017, and become president of France without any great history. Emmanuel Macron hadn't been elected to a fishing club before he became president of France. That was his first election. He didn't have a proper party behind him. He invented a party, En Marche, with his initials. And Eric Zemmour is likely to do exactly the same thing. I asked him last week who his prime minister would be, and he said, well, let's see who's around in April. So if he ends up in the Elysee, he'll be looking for a prime minister. He doesn't seem to have a huge number of friends. Certainly not within the political... He was losing
them in Marseille, wasn't he? I just wondered, Peter, if you'd reflect on those two pictures. I'm guessing it was taken with a motor wine camera, so as he was going by, there were two pictures taken very quickly. I wonder if we can throw them up again. This was Sunday. It was Marseille. There was a female protester who flipped him the bird, and he responded in kind. Is that damaging, or do people just... That's not what I've got in mind. But I described
it
fully. Not damaging.
Not really, no. I mean, Nicolas Sarkozy was well known for insulting the voters out on the street. It happens, and at the time when all this happened at the weekend, Eric Zemmour would you believe it, he'd just been visiting Roman Catholics in the wonderful Marseille Cathedral, which I'm sure you can picture, Collins, up on the hill there in Marseille. And he came out, and it was one of these things that happened in an instant. He's laughed it off. He said that somebody flicked a finger at him. He flicked a
it was
finger
about 20
back.
years ago when John Prescott was on the
Well, I was just
campaign
thinking
trail.
about that.
Yeah, I mean, and it did him no harm.
No, it didn't no harm at all. I think a bit of robust socialism in John Prescott's case, and in Eric's case, a bit of robust right-wing nationalism. I think people won't care about anything like that.
Peter, just you've mentioned that the interview you did with Zemmour. I mean, is it possible in the space of 60 seconds to give us your first impressions? What kind of man he was, is?
Well, it's not a first impression because he's been a hack. He's been a hacking journalist for many, many years, and we all know him from Paris. He's when you meet him, he's perfectly pleasant. If you listen to his discourse, it's terrifying, but you have to meet the man. He has these ideas. He's very ideological, Colin. He's somebody who harks back to Napoleon Bonaparte. Sounds a ridiculous cliche, but he's obsessed by Napoleon Bonaparte. He had a Bonaparte-themed 50th birthday party. And of course, Napoleon Bonaparte had all kinds of, dare I say, racist ideas, militaristic ideas. He wanted to invade Britain. And Eric Zemmour harks back to that time. Of course, if we got on to his views about Islam, he's also come in for criticism for his anti-Semitism, even though he is Jewish. So he's a man of all kinds of strange...
Wow, that's quite a trick to be pulled off for a Jewish politician to be accused of anti-Semitism. Crikey. Peter Allen, really good to talk to you. Thanks ever so much. Thanks for your time. Just take you back to our thought for the day. The fact it's Winston Churchill's birthday today. Would have been were he still alive. Darryl says, yes, we need a Churchill day. Mimi says, we have no time for cancel culture, but we don't need more public holidays. D, no idea what the D stands for. We don't need to dredge the past, but just appreciate it. Dion says, marvellous ideas. He made us proud of this country. And Chris says, May Day should become Churchill Day. What do you think? Let us know. Keep the poll votes coming in. Dan Gorton is next.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Good evening. It's been much milder today, but colder air is going to return. Certainly feeling cold in the winds tomorrow. A bit brighter with some sunshine, but there will be showers, and those showers in places likely to turn wintry. This area of low pressure is developing, and as it heads into the North Sea, really producing some strong winds across the coast of northeast England again. And after Storm Arwen hits at the weekend, that is not good news for this part of the world. As well as the winds picking up, there's going to be plenty of rain around. That rain turning heavy at the moment across Scotland. A band of rain will whiz across England and Wales this evening, followed by some very lively showers when the winds will suddenly just whip up. So you may get woken up by the gusty winds tonight. Temperatures dropping down, but generally staying a few degrees above freezing, thanks mostly to the strength of the wind. That wind will be very lively then along some North Sea coasts in the morning, providing plenty of showers here as well. Some of those could be of hail, rain showers for Wales, southwest England, and the showers turning more and more wintry over northern Scotland as the day goes on. But there will be sunny spells, and there's going to be a cold feel to the day. Temperatures back to single figures, and add on that wind, it feels even colder. Certainly getting pretty cold on Wednesday evening, with further snow likely over northern Scotland, and then the potential through tomorrow evening for a mixture of rain, sleet and some snow to push south over southwest Scotland, northwest England into parts of Wales. So in this zone you may wake up to a covering on Thursday morning. The potential for things to turn icy as well, because as the winds ease, temperatures will drop further. So it's a cold start to Thursday. Could be some ice around and still some snow mixed in as this weather system trickles south across Wales into southwest England on Thursday morning. So again, may wake up to a covering in places here. Generally a fine sunny day on Thursday, but it will be cold, but those winds at least will be a little bit lighter.
Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you.